I'm going to go ahead and invite the children to stay where you are, unless you want to come forward and be close, because sometimes that helps the story work a little better. But here's what I need to do. I need to tell you about my favorite story, and I need to tell you about the time I got into a little bit of trouble telling my favorite story. So here's what happened. I was visiting another congregation. We won't say which one. And I thought to myself, I've got a great sermon. I'm going to tell my favorite story. It's about this guy who was a chicken farm tourist. Now, I know that sounds a little weird. You're probably thinking to yourself, Douglas, there's no such thing. And you're right. But for the purposes of this story, there was this guy who liked to go around and visit chicken farms. He was a tourist. He was an aficionado of chicken farms. He really liked chicken farms. So one day he was visiting this one chicken farm, and he was looking around in the chicken yard, and he saw this bird in the chicken yard with all these other chickens that was actually an adolescent eagle. And he said to the farmer, "You know that this is not a chicken." And the farmer said, "All right, I found that chicken when it was just an egg, and I found it way out abandoned on the cliffs. And I know about chicken eggs, and so I brought that egg home, put it in the incubator, and when it hatched, I raised that chicken just like all the other chickens. I fed it chicken feed. It's been eating chicken feed all its life. It's a chicken." And the tourist said, "That is not a chicken. That is an eagle. Eagles eat chickens." And the farmer said, "Nope, not that one. That one thinks it's a chicken. All it's ever known in his life is being a chicken. Around it, all around it, is just other chickens." And the tourist said, "This is an affront to God. You cannot do this. This is not what this creature is." And he bent down, and when I'm telling the story in this other church at this point, I've been sitting with the kids. I stand up and act like I'm holding that eagle up high. And the tourist said, "You are one of God's greatest creatures. You were meant for better things. Spread your wings and fly." Meanwhile, the farmer just reached into his pocket, pulled out a little bit of chicken feed, threw it on the ground, and that eagle swooped right down to the ground and started scratching and pecking like a chicken does. "See, I told you," thinks it's a chicken. It's a chicken. And the tourist said, "I will not be deterred. I'm going to try again." "You can try till you're blue in the face. It's a chicken." So at this point, I pretended to pick the eagle up again. And I walked out to one of the chairs in the front of the congregation, and I stood on it. And I heard a little, and I'm like, "Ooh, I have them. They love this." And I said, the man went and he got the eagle and he climbed up to the top of the barn, and he held that eagle out the window at the top of the barn, and he said, "You are one of God's greatest creatures. You were meant for better things. Spread your wings and fly." Meanwhile, down on the chicken farm yard, the farmer threw out the chicken feed. The eagle came down and started pecking and scratching like a chicken does. I'm not going to quit. The next morning, early, before dawn, the guy got up and he went to the chicken yard and he scooped up that eagle and he carried it. He carried it away from the farm, out to the hills, out to the cliffs. And at this point, I go to the back behind the pulpit, and there's these big fancy chairs. Like, I should have known, really fancy chairs, right? And I stand on one of them, and I hear this, I'm like, "Oh, they're loving this." So you probably know what's going to happen. I'm like, "Oh, you're meant for better things." And so I'll be dramatic. "You are made for better things. Spread your wings and fly." And he released the eagle, and this time it did not look back. It did not look down. It just looked off to the rising sun, spread its wings, and flew. And then I looked at the kids and I said, You are all like eagles. And this congregation is the community that will support you and hold you up and remind you of who you really are. And the world will throw chicken feed in front of you and will ask you to behave in a way that is not real to who you are. You are one of God's greatest creatures. You were made for better things. Spread your wings and fly. And the kids are like, yeah. Later, I found out these chairs were antiques. They were weak in the center. They were refurbished a couple of times, and they kind of imagined me jumping up onto this chair in the middle of my dramatic story, putting a foot through one of them that is precious, precious chairs to them. Bless these people, they didn't tell me. My colleague told me a couple of months later. He said, I heard you told a story. I'm like, oh yeah, one of my best. He's like, So I got into a little bit of trouble with that congregation. They did invite me back later, so it wasn't that bad. But that was my favorite story, and how I got into a little bit of trouble telling my best story. It matters what stories we tell. Sometimes a story is a good and valuable story just because it's entertaining and it's enjoyable. Often, though, our stories have messages in them. And even more, the stories that we tell also shape the identity that we have. So the stories we tell about our history, they are messages about who we are, not just what happened. There's a power in the way we frame things that happened and talk about our history. This is the case even when we're not doing history, when we talk about just bedtime stories with children. We want messages for them that tell them who they are and how they can grow up to be. So our stories are very, very important. When I tell that favorite story, that story of the eagle in the chicken yard, it used to be my favorite story. For a long, long, long time, that was my all-time favorite story to tell. Over the years, though, I discovered that it's got an edge to it. It's got a kind of an us versus them component. Eagles are good, chickens are bad. Chickens are not bad. Right, chickens are some noble and beautiful creatures, as God intended, just like the eagle. And so there's that edge in that story that I've come to see as a little bit problematic, and it doesn't quite lift up our values. Now, there is an interpretation that I try to make at the end in which we all have two wolves inside us as one version of a story that folks tell, and which one do you feed? We all have two birds inside of us, an eagle and a chicken. Which one do you feed? But again, chickens are not that. So there's a little bit of a problem in the message that comes out in that story. So I've kind of stepped back a little. I still love the story, but I've stepped back a little bit from saying it's my favorite. So I want to tell you some of my favorite, not necessarily, well, I will try to get to my all-time favorite story, which I now call my favorite story. But I want to tell you some stories that have nourished me from the message that they supply me, and are, I think, illuminating to the values that uphold my life and may uphold yours as well. What are your favorite stories? So here's one. I told this story way, way back at the very early time that I was a minister here. This is a story about me, and I was a teenager or maybe a preteen. I was in the woods behind a friend's house. I was all alone, and I was just relaxing, looking around, and I found this one stone that was kind of grayish, normal looking stone. And I must have been in one of those science classes at that age, whatever it was, junior high or older elementary, where we were talking about subatomic particles and what makes up molecules and what makes up a rock, right? So I'm looking at this rock and thinking about the particles that are the atoms that are spinning around and all the bits and pieces inside there. And I'm just really getting interested in what makes up this rock that's in front of me. And then I go off on this different tangent, kind of a philosophy question that I must have heard at some point. Maybe it was introduced in a TV show or a movie, or maybe my mom said it to me or something. What if this entire vast swirling universe of ours is really just a tiny atom inside of the big toe of a giant other race? And all of a sudden, I had this, they sometimes call them oceanic experiences of mysticism, where it's like, I'm not really me anymore, I'm part of this stone, and all of the bits and pieces of the universe are swirling around inside this stone in front of me, as well as this giant with a toe, and everything, and I'm part of it. And all the universe and I and the 10,000 things are just this swirling sameness of which we are all a part inside this stone. And then I had this intrusive thought that was like, wow, that's really profound. You should remember that. And then slam, everything fell back into place. And I poked the rock, I couldn't get it to do that trick again. It's that experience of connectedness. Why do I love that story? To quote John Muir, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. It was an introduction to me about our interconnectedness, our place in the universe, if you will, of how we are all part of this. For my second story, I'm going to ask Amanda to share it for us.
The story begins in a simple New England white clapboard church. The minister was midway through the reading of the text when people in the back noticed a disheveled man walking up the aisle. He was not someone who had been there before. He had the look of a homeless person, unwashed and unpleasant. The people in the pews could smell him before they saw him, and people would lean a little or move their bags up onto the pew, making it clear to the man as he looked around the seats on his way up the aisle, "Don't sit here. There's no room for you in this pew." The homeless man made it all the way up to the front pew without finding a space to sit. With a shrug, he walked a few steps in front of the first pew and settled himself down on the floor in front of the pulpit. The minister had noticed him by now, having reached the conclusion of the reading, and looking up to see everyone's attention was fixed on the homeless man as he sat on the floor in the front. The minister noticed the head usher making his way down the aisle, and knowing the situation would soon be in hand, he launched into a pastoral prayer. Other people also noticed the respected elder of the church, who served as head usher, coming down the aisle. He moved slowly and with great purpose, leaning heavily on his cane as he walked. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief as they saw the old pillar of the community coming forward. He would deal with the homeless man. He would kindly but firmly escort the man out. When the elder arrived at the front of the church, he promptly dropped his cane onto the floor, and to everyone's great surprise and chagrin, they watched as he slowly lowered his stiff old form down onto the floor to sit with the other man. The minister had stopped his prayer mid-sentence. An awed silence filled the room. After a moment, the minister spoke with wisdom and humility, saying, All of you here will quite likely not remember a word of the prepared remarks I am about to offer, but every one of you will remember for the rest of your lives the example of compassion and hospitality we have just witnessed.
I will gladly work that story into a sermon every couple of years. It's so powerful. I love that story. It's one of my favorites. Why? I'm reminded of Maya Angelou's quote, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." Our faith has as one of its central values inclusion. Compassion rides right alongside that as to why inclusion matters. And so this story lifts up a step toward that beloved community that we long to create. So the third story I want to tell you, and then we'll take a break, we'll hear some more music, is from an author named Joshua Searle White. I got Searle White's stories when I was young in the ministry, and this book that he published came out about a decade back or more, and the one I'm going to tell you isn't in that book. It's from another collection that I found. It's called The Humming Planet. In this story, astronaut Annie had just been to a big convention on the planet system of Belden, and she had, it was a really good convention, and she was on her way home. And she was flying her spaceship, and she got stuck into a space storm that knocked out her circuitry and turned her around quite a bit, and she got lost. So she got her radar working again, and she figured out what was around her, and she saw there was a planet nearby. And she said, well, I need to go ask for directions because I'm a bit lost. So she lands on this planet. She opens up her door and she steps out, and it's this garden. It's this beautiful space. It actually looks quite a bit to her like Earth, but there's something a little bit different. Like the red of the flowers is just a little more red. The green of the leaves is just a little more green. And the air is, and it's not so much that there's a breeze blowing so much as there's a caressing with velvet hands that she just kind of felt. And even more, she heard a humming. So if you'll help me out, just like give a little humming. She heard a humming. And she thought, how odd, where's this humming coming from? And she stepped out of her ship into this greenery and these flowers, and the hum got a little bit louder as she got closer. She said, I like this. This is nice. And she started looking around. She found a path that went into town. And she said, all right, so I'm going to go to this town and ask around because I'm lost, and hopefully somebody can help me. So she goes into town and she sees all these people, and the humming is just amazing. And it seems to be coming not just from the animals and the plants and the greenery, but from the people. But they're not actually humming. She can see them talking to each other, helping each other, stopping to interact for a while or enjoy some beauty that is before them. They're not actually humming with their mouths, but there seems to be this humming that comes out of them. And she's like, wow, this is an amazing planet. I really like this humming planet. This feels really good. So she sees one person off to the side who's not really talking with anyone else, and so she figures it would be polite enough to ask him for directions. So she goes up and she taps on his shoulder. And there's this humming, but when he looks up, she is taken aback, and the humming around her stops. His face is frightening to her. He only has one eye. He seems to have some disfiguring. He's like scarred. And she takes a step back, and just, there's no more humming. She turns and she starts to walk away, and she notices that there's no more humming. And she stops. And she looks back, and she sees that the man is watching her curiously. And so she turns, and she starts to hear some of that humming again, just quietly. And she thinks, I'm not sure what's going on here. And she steps closer, and the humming gets louder. And she looks at him full in the face. And she says, I'm sorry that I ran away. I am lost, and I'm looking for directions. I don't know what planet I'm on. I'm looking for Earth. Can you help me? And he smiles, and he tells her that there's a building just a little down the way where there's people with telescopes and star maps, and they can help her. And she thanks him. And as she walks in the direction that he suggested, the humming is coming out of her. And it just feels so amazing. And she gets to that building, and she finds those people, those scholars, and the star charts, and she looks at stuff, and she figures out exactly where she is and where she needs to go, and everything is fine. And she's like, wow, thank you. And she even picks up a circuit part that she'll be able to plug into her ship really easily to be able to fix what got blown. And so she goes back to her ship, and she does that small repair, and she puts in the information that she got from their maps, and everything lights back up, and she knows how to get home, and she's about to close the door, but she looks back at this planet that is humming, and she doesn't want to leave. It feels so good to have that kind of connection. But she misses home. She misses her family. So astronaut Annie, she closes the door, and she launches back into space, and she heads home. Takes her a couple of weeks, but she makes her way, and she's home at last. She finds her planet, she finds Earth, she finds her country, and she lands in her own backyard, and she opens her door, and she hears her family, Annie's back! Annie's back! We're so excited! And she steps off her plane, off her ship, and she actually starts to hear, surprisingly, a little hum coming from her and from the people who are running, and the beautiful flowers that are planted in her family's yard. And she starts to think, but this is not the humming planet. How does this work? And she thought, maybe it's not about that planet. And she steps off her ship, and she goes about being home and enjoying her life and realizing that the humming is not just one place. It's something we carry within us. That's my third story. I'm going to take a break and have you hear some beautiful music. The story of the humming planet may well be my favorite story at this point. It's about empathy. When Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, it's that sense of finding that connection with others. And the hum that happens between you when you really get that level of connection. It's beautiful. It's amazing. But I'm not sure it's my all-time favorite story, because there's this other one. And I'm going to tell you this other one right now. It's the story, I might have tipped you off when I quoted John Muir earlier, but there's the story of John Muir. That this is a true story, really happened to him. And I love this story, and you've probably heard me tell it before, but here you go. You're sitting here, your captive audience. Feel this. I love this story because John Muir was this adventurer, he loved to just get out into the world. And he one time saw this storm coming through the land, and he thought to himself, I need to get to a place of safety. And so he turned around and he ran to a basement. No, not at all. That's what I would do. What John Muir did is he went out into the storm. He said to himself, I want to experience this windstorm. And so he went out into it. He walked around for a while until he found just a perfect copse of trees, stand of trees, and he started climbing one. Soldier pine is what they were called. And so he climbed up that tree, and in his journal he says he went up like 100 feet or something. And he's up there, and he strapped himself onto this tree. And wind came blowing, and all of the trees around him, including his, they were bending and swaying in the storm, and he was so exhilarated. He loved this. And he said he looked out on the valley, and the way that the trees moved, almost, it reminded him of waves on the ocean. Just the way that the branches in the valley that he could see were moving with this wind. He was so amazed by it. I've told you the shorter version of that story because I'm trying to also watch the clock. But it's phenomenal. For him, it was a seminal moment of connectedness. Love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus says. John Muir would say, these trees are my neighbors. And I love them. And one of the images that we often use in religion to talk about faith and to talk about how we can stay grounded when there's trauma or trouble in our lives is to cling to the rock, right? Something steady. And if you remember my earlier story, the rock has got all kinds of moving parts in it. And that image of something that will not move, something that you can hold on to and trust, is one message that we talk about in faith about how to survive trouble. John Muir teaches us something else. Those trees bent like 30 degrees, but he trusted. He trusted that tree to be able to bend so that it could survive. He trusted the trees around that tree so that as a community of trees, they protected each other as it swayed. When you have trouble in your life, I commend to you to be like John Muir and to find a tree as an image rather than a stone, something living, some piece of your faith that will bend when the storm blows you, that will have a community around you that will also support that bending and swaying so that the trouble can not have as hard of an impact on you. That's why I love that story. It's just so powerful. Walt Whitman wrote, "A blade of grass is the journey work of the stars," and it helps pull us into that sense of we are all journey works of the stars. John Muir said that everyone travels, everything travels. The trees travel in these circles in the wind, and some of our lives are not much more than the wavings of trees in our comings and goings. But John Muir calls to us to live as fully and as connectedly as possible. I offer another story, and I ask Amanda to read this next one as well.
This too is one of my favorites. There's a story of a boy who had a hard time controlling his anger. He would often lash out when he was angry. Finally, his mother told him that every time he lashed out in anger, he should go to the backyard and pound a nail into the fence. During the first few days, the boy was out in the backyard pounding nails several times a day. Over time, the boy went to the fence less often. Then the boy went an entire day without going out to the fence to pound in a nail. The boy said this to his mother, who replied, "Now every time you control your anger and do not lash out, I want you to go out and remove one of your nails from the fence." And this the boy did. Sometimes he would still pound a nail in, but more often he removed nails. Eventually, there came a day when the boy had not pounded a new nail into the fence in weeks, and he had removed all the nails from his earlier visits. His mother then took him out to the fence and said, "I'm proud of you. You have learned to control your anger. I want you to remember, however, that although you have removed the nails you had pounded into the fence, the holes from those nails are still there in the wood. You cannot take those away. You can only remove a nail that you have pounded into the fence, but you can never remove the hole that you make with the nail. So it is when you lash out with anger, his mother continued. You can apologize and be forgiven, but the damage you cause will always remain, at least in some fashion. It is good to apologize, better to not need to, but you will need to. No one can move through this life without creating a few nail holes.
I love this story because, as Jack Kornfield once said, forgiveness means giving up all hope of a better past. It's there. It's never not going to be something that happened. But forgiveness allows us to acknowledge that that's what happened, and we're going to then have a better future. We can't change what's past, but we can move into a better future. It's about repairing relationships. I love that story because it's a very concrete, very easy to understand story about a very complex piece of work, forgiveness and repair. So this last story that I want to tell you, 2 minutes before the end of the hour. 2 minutes. All right, so I'm going to do it anyway. Buckle up. It's actually a story that I wrote about a year and a half ago for a worship service on repair. And it's about the concept of tikkun olam. And it is a story of a grandfather and his... Sorry, I didn't have a granddaughter when I wrote this. When Miriam was a small child, her favorite thing was for her grandfather to visit and tell her bedtime stories. They lived nearby, and she was able to get a bedtime story from him at least once a week, and she loved to hear his stories. And her favorite story was the story of the shattered vessels. It's my favorite as well, he would say. And then he would tell her. There are many versions of how the world came to be, but the best is tikkun olam, because we get to take part. At the beginning, God created love, and there was so much love, it filled 10 large vessels, and God sent those vessels into the world, but the love was so powerful that it could not be contained by the vessels. And the love burst the vessels and it shattered them, and the love broke into many pieces, and it fell all over creation, all over the world. And it's our job to find all of the pieces, Miriam would say. And her grandfather would smile. Yes, Miriam, that is our part in creation. We need to gather all the scattered pieces and bring them back together to repair the world. And then he would lean closer to her and ask, and did you find any pieces today? And she always had an answer for him. She was 5 when she would talk about a sparkly rock that she found or a beautiful sunset that she had seen. And on this particular day, she said, I found another pretty feather. Feather, he would say, so impressed. Tell me about this feather. Show me your feather. And one time she asked him, Grandfather, have I figured this out right? It's like a big hide-and-seek game, right? I need to find all the bright and beautiful pieces and collect them all. And her grandfather smiled adoringly at her. Maybe it's a mystery. We tell the story, we ask the questions. It is good. Then that was when she was 5. Later, when she was 12, she found a different answer. She still loved that story. And she asked for it as often as any other story that he would come over to tell. And she had a different answer one time finally, when she asked him, did you find any pieces today? As a mature 12-year-old, she was proud to tell him, I have figured this out, Grandfather. I used to think that it was pieces of pretty things, that it was stuff, It's not stuff like glitter that had exploded all over everything. I know now that it's about finding love. Isn't that right, Grandfather? Love. He smiled at her. Maybe. And he would shrug every time she asked a question like that, and he would say, it's a mystery. We tell the story, we ask the question. It's good. But tell me more about this love that you have found this week. And she would. She would tell him about how she loved her parents, and that she loved him and grandmother, and on and on. Later, when she was in high school, he would still come over sometimes and they would talk. I mean, they didn't have bedtime stories. That was for kids. But she still did like to have him tell the story of Tikkun Olam, of course, even though she was too old for these bedtime stories. He would tell her, and he would ask, did you find any pieces today? And she would tell him about kindness, given and received. She would tell him about a boy who helped her figure out the answer to a homework problem, or the time that she helped a stranger at the grocery store. She says, I think it's silly when I used to think that the pieces of God's love were shiny rocks. And it's also a little bit embarrassing that I thought it was something mushy like feelings of love. I know that it's not about something you feel, it's about what you do. It's about kindness. Isn't that right, Grandfather? He would smile and shrug. Maybe. Tell me more about this kindness that you found this week. The years went on and Miriam grew older. She fell in love. She got married. She asked her grandfather to tell that favorite story at the wedding, which everyone loved. And a few years after that, when she was in her mid-20s, her grandfather grew ill and he went to a nursing home. She visited him every week. And he would ask her to tell him stories, which she did. And she would tell him her favorite story about Tikkun Olam. And then he would ask her, did you find any pieces today? And one day, when he asked her that, she was quiet for a while thinking, and she said, Grandfather, I do think I really have finally figured this out. The pieces are not just beautiful, shiny things, but they're not love or kindness either. It's all of it. All of it together. Isn't that right? He smiled adoringly, and he shrugged. And he said, maybe. We tell the story. We ask the questions. It is good. And so her life went on. She had a career helping people in her way. She and her spouse had a child, and together they told her child that story. And each day she would find a new piece. She would look for beauty, show it to others. She would make her life and the lives of the people around her better. She would repair the world one day at a time. Let it be. It goes without end.